Can you hear me at the end? If I tend to be more mobile than is apt of professors. So if I fade out a bit, raise your hand, and I'll know that I should get back to square one, so to speak. Okay? Well, thank you so much for your very, very kind and generous remarks introducing me. I wish my children were here. They might be influenced a little bit. I'm usually there to provide laughs, not for anything else. It's a great honor to be here. My wife and I have never been to New Zealand before, and I now can't imagine why. But your invitation has been a real eye-opener for both of us. The Economics of Biodiversity is all-embracing in some sense, and I thought before I kick off with the lecture, I give you a sense of where I'm coming from and why I took up the invitation of the UK government, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to prepare a review, which has in fact benefited me enormously because preparing reviews of this sort, at least I've never had an experience before of doing that, but it concentrates the mind and in a way that I wasn't quite used to, so I've learned enormous amounts in the last 8 months, and the review will be submitted sometime in August, I guess, in time for the China COP15 meeting in October. My own interest in this field came not because I knew much about biodiversity, but I was interested in deep poverty in Africa and Asia, which is where I come from, South Asia, which is where I was born and raised in India. It struck me that development economics, or the economics of poverty, was poor in not recognizing that households in poor countries, in rural households, depend directly on the local natural capital they inhabit. The local forest, if there is one, the grassland, if there is one, the threshing ground, if there is one, few animals, the water holes. And it struck me when I read the anthropological literature or anthropologists who were far ahead of economists in this field, I got a sense that the way we modeled the household was quite wrong and misleading, because a great deal of the activities of the household on a daily basis was outside the market. It's not as though they weren't involved with the market. They bought and sold, for sure. But a great deal of their daily income, quote unquote, the wherewithal, came from the local environment. So when deep poverty struck, in the sense that you observed villages migrating in distress, and the tendency would be to say there was administrative failure or governance failure, my eye was more on the resource base which had disappeared or deteriorated to the point where they couldn't survive. The economics of biodiversity is rich because it is extremely varied. It's spatially diverse. What the life experiences of a village household in Bihar, the state of Bihar in India, would be very different from the life experiences of a household in Nepal, will be in turn very different from the life experiences of a household in Africa and Latin America and so forth. They are very spatially specific because the grassland differs from a rainforest. The rainforest differs from a temperate forest, and so on. All this is obviously, in some sense, truisms. But the trick is to see whether you can lift yourself out from this heterogeneity of experiences and come to some picture of the world which builds on the commonality of the human experiences. I've never found differences in human experiences all that interesting. What interested me always was the fact that people were essentially facing very similar problems. Of course, articulated in different ways, goes without saying. The history differs, the ecology differs, and so forth. But deep down, what we care about are our family, our neighbors, our children, our great-grandchildren, and so forth, and we have to solve some resource allocation problems to meet them. And the core of economics, in my judgment, was there, how to tease out of the heterogeneity of experiences something like a unified picture of the forces that operate. So there are several ways of attacking, looking at the economics of defining or framing the economics of biodiversity. You could do the story, you can tell the story or look at it, study it, as I did in my early days, at a very, very heterogeneous way, very spatially specific, or you can lift yourself out of those specificities and think in some abstract global picture. And in this talk today, I want to do the latter. I want to do the latter because in some ways we are led to thinking globally through our interest in the economics of climate change. If you think about what you've been reading in the newspapers over the last 5-10 years, let's say since Time magazine had a cover story on climate change in 2005, that's all very recent, by the way. We think we know this has been around for a long while. It hasn't. It was denied in a big way until very recently, only 15 years ago. 2005 was, I think, in some sense a watershed because Time magazine is extremely influential, and there was a cover story saying, "Be worried, be very worried." Okay? But the narrative there was simplified to the point of noticing that there is a parameter you can look at, which is carbon concentration, and then from there a mapping, an estimate of the implication of carbon concentration on global mean temperature. And then, of course, you can sidetrack and see what the effect of that functional relationship is on distribution of storms and rainfall and everything, and that will be spatially heterogeneous. But the focus was, again, nevertheless, despite the heterogeneity, on a global picture. So we think in terms of a global public bad, in this case, in contrast to global public good. At the margin, carbon concentration is now harmful, at the margin. And then we worry about how to think of it as an economic commodity with a negative price. We call it the social cost of carbon. Now, one weakness, in my judgment, and then I'll come to my talk, of this entire literature, is there is a sense in which it encourages us, the literature on the economics of climate change, encourages us to think of the human economy as distinct from the biosphere, from Mother Nature. We're outsiders. Nature is there, we are here. We dip into nature, take stuff out, convert it for our purposes, consumption, output and consumption, and then there is waste, which we then throw back into nature. And that exchange is what we study in the economics of climate change. Now, it might seem as though I'm hitting some metaphysical picture of us versus the nature, and at the end of the day, most of us economists work with mathematical models, let's face it, or we estimate econometric models. Okay, so where is all this metaphysics coming in? Well, it does, because our models reflect our conception of who we are, maybe several steps away, but if you look deeply into them, that's what it's about. Instead, when I think about biodiversity, and I'll come to it in some precision, I think of the human enterprise as being embedded in nature. And that has deep implications for our conception of what we can achieve, how much, what we can aspire to. And there are details which I'll be hinting at towards the end of this lecture, but I can assure you there are formal mathematical models, all kosher, all publishable. In fact, My latest paper will be published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in about 3 weeks or so. So it's okay. It meets the standards we feel economists ought to aspire to. Nevertheless, we really have to lift every now and then out of that prism and look at the world in a humane way, in the way our humanity demands of us to do, because these are extremely important matters. What we leave behind for our descendants is what is at stake. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Okay, let me just see how I can, if I can I'm going to press a button, and it may do not what I want it to do. Ah, it does. Biodiversity means the diversity of life. Because genes combine to form species, species combine to form assemblages, and assemblages combine to form communities that interact with the physical world to create ecosystems, biodiversity does not only mean the diversity of genes and species, but also diversity of ecosystems. My unit of account is going to be something like an ecosystem. An ecosystem is, it's easier to think about it as opposed to defining. Our stomachs are ecosystems, as are the mountains ecosystems, watersheds are ecosystems, the domestic pond is an ecosystem. It's an arbitrary classification. Something which you think has a boundary. It interacts with the boundary, and the relationship with the boundary is weaker than the relationship of the ingredients inside it. Okay, so that's as simple as that. Being too precise misses the point. And biodiversity here is the diversity of life, the diversity of ecosystems. So it's biodiversity is not, I'll come to that in a minute, but it's not really an asset. Ecosystems combine the abiotic environment with biological communities, plants, animals, fungi, microorganisms that form functional units. And you can see the moment I say functional units, I've already injected an anthropocentric picture in here, and I'll come back to that. As to the limitations of it, and I'll come back to that before I proceed much further. So ecosystems are assets, so we call them natural capital. You've heard that expression. It's commonplace now, to contrast them from roads, buildings, machines, which we call produced capital, and from education, health, and aptitudes, which we now call human capital. We economists have a history of expanding the notion of capital. Classical political economists thought in terms of, well, having said that, I'm not sure I should speak because I'm not a historian of economic thought. So this is a slightly flaky rendering. As far as I can understand it, as far as I know, classical political economists thought of capital as being produced capital. Roads, buildings, and so forth. Factories, mills, I guess. Human capital was introduced formally into economics quite recently, about 50 years ago or so, because there are measurement problems. How do you measure the benefits of education or good health? But it has now very much entered the scene, and natural capital is, of course, now part and parcel of how we think about the asset base of our economy. Notice I've already moved to the notion of assets. And I'll come back to that in a minute. A crude but effective measure of an ecosystem is its live biomass. An ecosystem's productivity is the rate at which it produces biomass through photosynthesis, net of respiration. Just as diversity of stocks in a financial portfolio is itself not a stock but a characteristic of a stock, namely the portfolio, biodiversity is not an asset, it is a characteristic of an asset, and the asset being an ecosystem. Bear that in mind. We value diversity in the portfolio of financial portfolio among many reasons, one of them being that you never know what the return of it from a stock is. And so you want to diversify, which means they should not be too correlated, because if one goes up, the other might go down. If one goes down, the other might go up. And on average, you want to have less uncertainty about the performance of your portfolio. Ideally, you would like negative correlation. If one goes up, the other definitely goes down, and vice versa. So it fixes the mean. But typically, we think insurance companies think in terms of independent risks, so that on average, the fluctuations are evened out by the law of large numbers. Okay? So likewise, the value of biodiversity, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I'm now referring to the work of a huge amount of work that's been done by ecologists, and I've been very fortunate in having ecologists train me over the past 30 years, so I speak with some authority, although I'm not an ecologist myself. But what's useful to think of biodiversity as being bits and pieces, organisms which interact within the ecosystem to produce services, which I'll come to in a minute. So already you can see I'm moving in a direction here this evening towards looking at the biosphere, or ecosystems, which are components of the biosphere, as factories, gigantic factories, or very, very tiny factories. Like my mouth is an ecosystem, all sorts of bacteria working away and keeping me reasonably healthy. So it's a factory churning out stuff, and we want to see what the stuff is. So the economics of biodiversity is the economics of the biosphere. And because ecosystems are assets, the economics of the biosphere involves the study of asset management problems. Now you can see that I'm hitting an economic tone here. And I want to stop for just a minute to assure you that I'm not taking a vulgar economic position here. Why do we care about the biosphere? Why do we think it's very important? Well, let me give you a story, which is true. 1997, in the journal Science, very respectable journal, an article was published by a group of ecologists who tried to estimate, who offered an estimate of the benefits humanity enjoys from the biosphere. And the estimate, they knew it was amazingly approximate. Many things were missing, and heaven knows what. But the estimate was something like, let us say, I can't remember exactly, but I'm talking order of magnitude, something like 32 to 33 trillion US dollars a year of benefits. Beg your pardon? Oh, sorry, yes. Thank you. Something like 33 trillion international dollars in about 1997. And the idea was to say that, look, the biosphere matters. It's extremely important. See how valuable it is. Now, when I read it, I thought it was just upside down. It was just the wrong way of going about it. Because if the biosphere disappears, we disappear. We are dead. So there's nobody to exchange $33 trillion per year. Economics is supposed to serve our ethics. It's not determining our ethics. And I think that's where it went wrong, that kind of calculation. We care about the biosphere because it is part of us, or we are part of it. How we work within it is, of course, the moot point. And we want to estimate the value of changes that we bring about to the biosphere by our actions. A dead zone here, an improved lake there, and so forth. And they're competing with many of our other aspirations, like roads, buildings, education, and so forth. So we're looking at an asset management problem. And I want to stick to this. When I say the asset management problem, it is an asset management problem no matter which culture you come from. That's the key thing. This is not making this claim that the economics of biodiversity is about managing assets, is not a claim that this is a modern European view of life. If you happen to be a forest inhabitant in Assam, they too are concerned with managing assets. In fact, I know of no household which is not concerned with managing assets. That's how I began this lecture, by saying I was studying households, and they have to manage assets. So it's an asset management problem. How you value the assets, of course, that's where some of the interesting questions arise, and I'll come to that as we go along. What we bequeath to our descendants are assets. By assets, I mean durable goods. Okay? We don't hand over services to our children, we hand over rights to services. We sometimes say, I'm handing over income to my grandson, but you're not. You're handing over claims to income to your grandson. That is, you're handing over assets. It could be in the form of education, it could be in the form of good health, it could be in the form of cultural norms, assimilation of cultural norms, which makes life easier for the person to work in the society he or she happens to be. But that's what we're doing. So I'm very much engaged in the economics of biodiversity with the management of assets. Just as private firms create balance sheets, national governments should now create a system of wealth accounts, in which wealth includes not only the value of produced capital and human capital, but natural capital too. Now, this is a throwaway line. There's a huge amount of economics embedded in that last sentence, but I've actually led you towards it anyway, because if you're interested in assets, then you look at the portfolio you're handing over, and you have to figure out how to measure the value of the portfolio that you're giving to your children, grandchildren, and so forth and so on. Okay? So I'm now moving, as I say, using very often the imagery of the household, but then mapping it onto the level of the nation, and maybe, as I go along, to the globe as a whole. The globe as a whole is easier to study than individual nations, because you don't have to worry about trade. It gets imports and exports balance off. Of course, there is issues of inequality and so forth, but I will come to that. I'll ignore that for a while today. What does the biosphere as an asset offer? Well, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of 2005, a really pioneering piece of work by an enormously large group of economists and ecologists, something like 1,500 people were involved in it, provided a classification and in some sense set the tone of the discussion. This classification has been modified subsequently, but I find theirs still to be, for my purposes, very, very useful. They talk about provisioning services, the services which yield food, fiber, timber, and water. It's extremely important to bear this in mind, and I'll come back to the tensions that arise in our use of the biosphere. Second, regulating services, protection against natural hazards such as storms and the disease environment, climate system. Protection against natural hazards, you need an example, mangrove forests, very classic examples of how they protect villages behind the incoming storms from protection. And mangrove forests are rich in biodiversity. They do many other things besides. They allow for fish populations to thrive, and so forth. Okay? So the mangrove, which is giving regulating services, is also providing food. So there are provisioning services appearing. So there are multiple products that come out of these ecosystems. Supporting services, nutrient cycling, recycling, soil production, waste assimilation. And I want to emphasize waste assimilation in a minute, because the economics of climate change is all about waste. The waste being carbon dioxide, which you're producing as a byproduct of what you're producing, namely a trip in an airplane. Okay? So that's a waste. It's a waste because you're dumping it back into the biosphere. All right? So I want to focus on that later on. So that's supporting services. Now, notice one thing. Regulating and supporting services are on the whole anonymous. You don't see them. You don't feel them. Well, you do feel them when the storm comes and you're hiding, but the point is that service is sort of very intangible. It's not like fruit growing in a tree, which is more tangible. And I'll come back to that, because in some ways our deep problems with the biosphere, are the way we have mismanaged our lives, rests on the fact that many of these services are hidden. We don't even know that they're there. The soil, for example, what happens, the soil is one of the most, I've been reading about soil for quite some time now, and as ecosystems, they're absolutely fascinating, largely because people know, except for the soil scientists, very little about them. But, of course, they're absolutely essential for our lives. And then fourth is cultural services, recreation, cultural landscape, aesthetic, and spiritual experiences. Okay? Now, there is a deep sense in which our societies have run into a tension between type 1 provisioning services and the other three. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay? I just want to flag that it's not as though we can have all of them, they're in competition for our attention. And very often we have, in the past, gone for one and harmed 2, 3, and 4. Okay? The demands we make of the biosphere takes two forms. We harvest the biosphere's goods and services for consumption and production. Say, think of fisheries, forests, aquifers are prototypical sources. Fisheries, there's a fishery, you take the stuff out. I gave you a picture of our relationship with biosphere as being external, and that fits in well with this description. And then we use the biosphere as a sink for our waste. Landfills, dead zones, and carbon concentration in the atmosphere are prominent examples, and I won't belabor that point. But the reason I want to distinguish these two, but keep them in our mind, is that they are mirror images of each other. And if you see that, you immediately recognize that pollution is the reverse of conservation, and that we are really talking about the same phenomenon, our engagement with the biosphere. So if you think of pollution as a separate activity, it requires a separate treatment from harvesting natural resources, harvesting from the biosphere, then you are missing something. The two amount to, one is a positive and the other is a negative impact. And that connection says that we can unify the two forms of demand and view the biosphere as a renewable natural resource. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'm now aggregating in a massive way, but I feel comfortable doing that because I can give you a very micro story with the same kind of classification, and that will be very reasonable. So the link between the very micro and the global is not, in principle, different from the way that we create the link between household economy and the global economy. Never mind ecosystems. We do things about global GDP. Well, there we are, global GDP. What does that mean? You're adding up all the final outputs, using market prices, of course. We have a problem here. We can't do that because many of these services don't have markets. So you have to value them outside the market system. Okay? So I would like you to think of the biosphere for our purposes now, for this lecture, for the next few minutes, as a renewable resource like a fishery or a forest. Fish are born, they live, and then die. You can catch fish, and so long as you don't take fish out at a rate faster than their natural regenerative rate for too long, you're okay. You can have a sustainable fishery. But you keep on taking more than the rate at which they can regenerate themselves, net birth rates, then of course the fishery eventually dies. Collapse of a fishery through overfishing. That imagery is very powerful and correct. There's nothing wrong with that imagery, and I want to fill that in what follows. By an ecosystem's productivity, remember, notice I'm using it now totally as though nature is a productive asset, and I want to see how far we can run with it. We mean the flow of goods and services it offers us and its ability to withstand disturbances. I look at the second one as well because looking only at means, the average, is very dangerous. With uncertainty, you really do want to look at the risk involved in it. So ability to withstand disturbances, sometimes nowadays it's called resilience of the system, picks up our attitude towards risk. It's extremely important what I've just now said because a great deal of the work in the economics of climate change has actually ignored the uncertainty part. And they have looked at average, mean expected values of losses due to higher carbon concentrations. So when you read sometimes, as The Economist is prone to publishing, because they like to show that hard-headed economics tells you not to worry too much, that, say, the Greenland ice caps all disappear, and it will only add 5 cents to the social cost of carbon, and you say to yourself there is something deeply wrong about economics, it's not economics which is at fault, it's the misuse of it. You're looking at only the mean and only those things you can measure, because it doesn't pass the laugh test, which is if Greenland ice disappears, it's not going to be just, if somebody says it's 3 cents more on the social cost of carbon, you would say there's something inherently implausible in it, in this estimate. Okay. So I want to include resilience. We may think of an ecosystem's productivity as the rate at which it regenerates itself, subject to the uncertainty, of course. So note the similarity with the productivity or performance of financial portfolios. And I keep on coming back to that because in a minute I'm going to give you some hard economics. So there is a tension between our demands as they appear in 1, that is provisioning services, food, timber, water, and so forth, and 2 to 4, supporting regulating and cultural services, which we have already, respectively. The more we convert the biosphere so that it serves 1, provisioning services, the less there is of it to serve 2 to 4, regulating, supporting, and cultural services. Now, this is a commonplace observation. You hear and you sense that when great swaths of land are converted into farmland, you have lost something. That tension is what I'm pointing to here. Okay? You need to produce food, so you need agriculture. Okay, but that has a cost. And the cost is in terms of services which might undermine other aspects of our life, not just spiritual, but our sustenance. Now, a large and extremely interesting, valuable literature has found, or research has found, biodiversity enhances ecosystem productivity in supplying, supporting, regulating, and cultural services. Biodiversity is not very useful for agriculture. We know that the whole point about agriculture is to make it extremely homogeneous. You're actually killing biodiversity, or plantations. I want to bring this out because when you hear the expression biodiversity is a contributor to ecosystem productivity, it's not all the services, it's one class of 3 classes of services, extremely important, easy to miss, and that's why we're in a mess, because we miss it. We don't miss the food side, we don't miss the water side, we don't miss the forest side, excuse me, but we do miss these hidden services which are keeping us afloat. And here, the reason is very similar to our financial portfolios. You have species waiting in the wings. Times are good, they'll be waiting in the wings, because the dominant species will provide the services, the ecosystem that you value. But times get rough, and the dominant ones weaken. The ones which are waiting in the wings, this is of course a metaphor. But now the conditions are right for them. Maybe their root system is slightly different, longer, deeper, less spread out. But now that comes in helpful. So very much like financial portfolios, biodiversity serves that purpose. At another level, another way of looking at it would be to say that biodiversity, whether at the genetic level, gene level, or whether at the level of ecosystems themselves, because some ecosystems provide this kind of service, other ecosystems provide some other service, so there's complementarities there, would be that maybe biodiversity is a bit like having complementary inputs in production or in consumption. In consumption, if you have only left shoe but not a right shoe, well, it's not going to be very helpful. You need one of each. Those are complements. Likewise, in a factory, if you have only labor but no machine tools, not much output comes out. Machine tools but no labor, not much output comes out. You need both. Complementarities. So there is an element of that in biodiversity as well. So biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. They are not ecosystems themselves. Asset managers, from the household all the way up to the government, study the returns their portfolios offer. Whether the services we draw from the biosphere in total is large or whether it's small in proportion to an economy's GDP is not the issue. And I want to illustrate what I mean by that. So suppose somebody began with that example where the biosphere offers 25 or 33 or whatever trillion dollars. And I explained why that's a bogus, meaningless estimate, because it doesn't tell you anything. But suppose somebody says something much more meaningful. Say that pollination contributes to agriculture in the UK to the tune of, I might get this wrong, but look, we're talking about orders of magnitude, 580 million pounds a year. Okay? I think I've got it right, approximately right. In fact, the Chancellor of the Exchequer used that when he announced to Parliament that he had asked me to prepare the review of the Economics of Biodiversity. Now, that's a perfectly meaningful statement. Because if that's withdrawn, it's not going to be the end of humanity. It'll be a bit rough on UK agriculture, that's for sure, but it's a meaningful statement. That's the benefit agriculture has from pollination. So you value the pollinators, the bees, the birds, and so forth, and earthworms, and so on. Okay? Does that tell you how much you should spend on investing in pollinators? You see, that's the key thing, because you're an asset manager, remember. So you want to know which assets to invest in. That pollination gives a huge amount each year to agriculture on its own is not going to tell you whether you should put your money on pollinators or not. I came across this phenomenon some years ago when a group of us tried to estimate the quantity of the inclusive wealth of India and in 4 other countries. So the idea was to look at the estimate produced capital, human capital, and natural capital. And never mind whether we got it, how approximately wrong we got it. We got it wrong, sure, but righter than most other people because they ignored most stuff anyway. So we found something very interesting, at least to us it was, the authors, which was that human capital absolutely swamped by 2 orders of magnitude produced capital and natural capital. What do I mean by that? I meant that if you write down the amount that you've estimated of the wealth of India, aggregate wealth of India, adding up all these bits and pieces, then something like 99% of that wealth is in human capital. Why? Because the reason is that people prefer to live than to die, and we value life hugely. And so what we wanted to do, we wanted to measure the improvement in human capital, the quantity of human capital, the value of human capital in India over a period of time. Meanwhile, during that period, life expectancy had increased in India. Altogether a good thing, so you need to value that. And what we did was to use the value of a statistical life, which is a very well-known way of thinking about the value of not a person's life, but statistical life. It's not a value of a life, but statistical life. Turns out it's huge. It's about $6 million, even in a poor country like India, at least at the time we were doing it. So you add them up, it's about 99%. Okay, what do you take from that? Do you then say, oh, we should put more money into health? All the investment of government should go in there? Or maybe you say, well, that's enough. Now we should put all our money in elsewhere. Intuition doesn't tell you where to go. And that's right. Intuition shouldn't, because these figures are not meant to tell the portfolio manager what to invest in. What does tell him is rate of return. So the portfolio manager in financial portfolios is on the right track. Now, of course, the return I'll be talking about is different from financial return, that you'll see in a minute. So now here's the first exercise. I'm really rather proud of this because my college's friends never did this exercise, although they had the ingredients to do that. Using remote sensing data, planetary net primary productivity, that is, the net output of biomass per year, is currently about 105, has been estimated to be currently, I'm sorry, this is the grammatically incorrect, estimated to be about 105 trillion kilograms. Okay, I'm asking you to take the figure as a fact, quote unquote, as a factoid. The same techniques have been used to estimate the global stock of live biomass, which has been found to be about 550 trillion kgs. So the latter is a stock, the former is a flow. And remember, we started with the notion of biomass as being the currency with which we look at the productivity of an ecosystem, and that distribution of that biomass is what's giving us the services. So we have a story of the productivity of ecosystem in terms of biomass, production and the stock. So one is a flow and the other is a stock. So what does a manager do? He divides one by the other to look at the average rate of return. If you do that, the global average rate of return is 19% a year, 105 divided by 550 a year. Okay? When compared to government bonds in the UK, for example, say 4% a year, we are staring at a huge distortion in the global economy. Investment should now be directed at enhancing the biosphere, not shrinking it, because the return on the biosphere is much higher. Never mind prices. We haven't come to that yet. I'll show you exactly how to nail this argument down. So you have your own rate of return of 19% in one case, never mind whether the figure is exact. Believe the figure. It's a huge ballpark difference between that and the produced capital return, which is reflected in, say, the government bond. If this were an efficient portfolio, how would you close the gap between the two own rates of return? If you've ever dealt with financial economists, they will tell you capital gains, the relative price change during the year. So if this was an efficient portfolio, which of course we know it isn't, but I'll nail it down in a minute, the gap between 19% and 4%, which is 15%, should be the capital gains on produced capital. Because produced capital is a very low return, 4%, in own rate of return. So if its value goes up relative to the biosphere by 15%, then at the margin we are indifferent between holding an additional unit of the biosphere, an additional unit of produced capital. This is bread and butter portfolio analysis. First-year undergraduates do this. That's called the efficiency, it's called arbitrary equation, I think, in financial capital. Some people are nodding, so I know there are financial experts here. You can see why. I mean, it's very easy to see this equation. I think I owe it to you to explain it slightly better. You have $1 million, and you can put it in the bank and earn, let us say, 4% a year. So at the end of the year, you will have $1 million plus 4% of $1 million. As against that, you could buy a house, and it'll give you some rent. Okay? Suppose the rent of that is less than 4% of $1 million. 30,000, let's say. 40,000 would have been 4%. So do you then say, no, I'm going to put the money in the bank? No, you don't, because you ask, at the end of the year, will there be some capital gains on my house? Will the price appreciate? And if the price appreciates just that much to close the gap, you'll say, well, I'm indifferent between putting the money in the bank or the house. Because the rent on the house is like the own rate of return, which I've just now calculated for the biosphere, and on top of that, there will be the capital gains. In this case, the capital gains need to be on the produced capital because the own rate of return was very low relative to the biosphere. But of course, we know it's just the wrong way around. If the capital gains on the produced capital is to rise, it means you have undervalued produced capital, but meanwhile, of course, you are accumulating produced capital and decumulating the biosphere, and I'll come back to that evidence in a minute. So it suggests that we're completely off kilter. Our portfolio management of the biosphere is completely and utterly wrong. And this is, to me, about as convincing a way of showing how we have overreached our dealings with nature. There are many, many others, but this is about as convincing because it gets hard to the economic argument. Never mind the approximations involved. So how and why has this imbalance come about? And I will end this lecture by going a little bit into it. The economist Angus Madison, the late Angus Madison, spent most of his life at the OECD, and he was one of those number crunchers. In some deep sense, very boring. But to me, he is a giant, because what he tried to do was to estimate, track the world economy back to year 1 CE, 2,000 years ago, and see how the various regions, including the globe itself, has prospered since then. Whatever data he could get hold of, he tried. And the story he gave, I mean, his book was published in 2001, a few years before he died, and I think it's very, very revealing, which says something like this. It's consistent with many other stories, by the way, many other accounts. But this one is saying that per capita GDP from year 1 onwards, now you're normalizing, so let's say at year 2000 prices. So I'm aware of the fact that price changes have taken place, so you're normalized for that, corrected for that. Per capita GDP was a little over $1.90 until about 1500 AD, or CE. It was pretty flat. All the regions, there are 5 regions he looked at: Europe, Asia, Africa, the New World, and so forth. And then there was hardly any variation. Of course, there were fluctuations, the Black Death and so forth, but over the long haul, it was pretty flat. And people were desperately poor, on average, desperately poor. You can track also life expectancy, which are much more reliable data. And life expectancy didn't change very much. We are looking at 26, 27, 28 years life expectancy at birth. Constant remaining, pretty much constant. Of course, Black Death again screws up things, but broadly speaking, this is true. Things started diverging about 1500, as you know from normal discourses on economic history, particularly took place in Europe, and then subsequently in the New World. And there was a big divergence from Asia, including China. But the real action started, as we all know from our rudimentary economic history, the Industrial Revolution. And some parts of the world took off. But before we get too carried away, they didn't really take off. Not in a huge way. Per capita annual income in year 1950 globally was $3,500 international dollars at 2011 prices, let us say. Now, excuse me, that's a lot higher than the 780 or so that prevailed until about 1200, the $1.9 a day, the World Bank poverty line, as it were. But today, per capita income in the world is about 17,000 international dollars. So there's been a 5-fold increase in per capita income. Population has increased from 2.5 billion to 7.7 billion. So you've had a 3-fold increase there. So multiply the two, and you have a 15-fold increase in global GDP over a 70-year period. This is my economic calculation. I did that because I read an article in 2016 in Science, which showed, it's a beautiful piece of work by earth scientists who collated the evidence of biogeochemical signatures, including phosphorus and nitrogen deposits in ice cores and sediments, tracked it from the past. There's a huge amount of data out there, and they were basically summarizing it. And they found that if you plot it from year 11,000 minus to now, they can do that, by the way, then you have essentially a flat curve like the Madison data on national income and life expectancy, and then takes a huge sharp turn about 1950, upwards, the hockey stick that you're familiar with, those of you who have looked at time series of carbon concentration and carbon temperature. So it's not just carbon, it's not just temperature, it's a whole bunch of other signatures, which of course brings me back to the biodiversity issue. Because it's not just climate change, but the tampering of the biosphere has been enormous in this last 70 years. To the extent that now, officially, earth scientists are telling us that 1950, you have to take some date, is the year where we entered the Anthropocene. If you Google it, you will find, if you say, what's the Anthropocene, they'll tell you. The earth scientists now saying it, and you have to choose something. But it's a dramatic break is what did the trick. So I looked at this economic data only to convince myself that there was something going on which would give me a consistent picture of our overshoot. So, question why? The overshoot can be understood in terms of the idea of externalities, which are the unaccounted for consequences for others of the actions we take. That's pretty straightforward. You know all about that. We know about the tragedy of commons. So much of the biosphere is an open access resource, meaning that its products and services do not have a price attached to them, leading to the tragedy of the commons. You're familiar with that literature. It's correct. But the force of that tragedy has been felt more recently, and I'll come back to that in my concluding remarks. The matter is made worse by government subsidies on agriculture, energy, water, and forestry. Nature supporting and regulating services now come with a negative price. So it's not just the tragedy of the commons. We have a double whammy. Something which should have a positive price would have a zero price because of the tragedy of the commons, the openness of the biosphere. But on top of that, we are encouraging ourselves. We're giving us the incentive, financial incentives to take some more out. So it's a negative price. That really creates distortions. Question, why do we think? What happened about 1950? Many things happened. I suspect, for example, antibiotics have a lot to do with it because it made life so much better for us. And of course, it had a trigger mechanism for population growth as well. We have never had it so good, that's for sure. And we are told that repeatedly. And this morning when we were having a discussion, we all agreed we've never had it so good. This last 70 years have been a terrific time to be alive. You would choose this period over any other period if God dropped you randomly into some household or the other. It would be a no-brainer. This is the time to be born. But the cost is what the future, our descendants. That's the real problem. And that's what I'm really focusing attention on here. And that is, we don't have the mechanism to correct for this override. One of the reasons the last decades have been particularly harmful is that our technologies have accentuated the errors or deficiency of our institutions. So technological advances in, say, fishing, deep-sea fishing, technological advances in mining, technological advances in deforestation, timber gathering, those advances were targeted at saving labor cost, not saving natural capital. In fact, just the reverse. They were aimed at how do we get the stuff out from there and convert it. So I'm very skeptical when people say, oh, technology will fix our problems. I'm skeptical about it for a variety of reasons. One of them is that you don't have the incentives, right incentives. So the distortions which leads us to the problem are also the distortions which exacerbate the problem because the technological breakthroughs are working against the problem. So now I want to wrap up. I want to summarize. I mean, I'm an economic theorist, and you've been wondering, where's the equation? So here it is. One way of thinking about it, and the only way of summarizing what I've been saying, is to think of the biosphere as a pool from which we take, that's the metaphor that I've been using all evening, and we want to look at the demand we make of it on an annual basis, let's say, and its capacity to supply it. If the demand exceeds the supply, the quality and quantity of the biosphere in terms of biomass declines. If it's less, then the biosphere improves. We see this locally. When you have a restoration project, say, for example, Zealandia, well, that's where the biosphere, not the biosphere, but that ecosystem has improved. So what you're taking out is less than what its regenerative capacity is. So we've seen that, but I'm now looking at globally. So if N, capital N is global population, Y is the standard of living, GDP per capita. I mean, you want to use GDP per capita because that's it's easily measurable, or at least we think it's easily measurable. And alpha is a numerical measure of the efficiency with which nature's products and services are converted into GDP. Humanity's aggregate demand from the biosphere is N times Y divided by alpha. In a sustainable state of affairs, that demand equals the supply, which I'm going to call capital G. That capital G depends on the stock, capital S. So I've got a very conventional capital theoretic model, asset management problem. If, however, aggregate demand exceeds or is less than the biosphere regenerative rate, the stock S diminishes, correspondingly increases. Over the past 70 years or so, since we entered the Anthropocene, we have an inequality. The demand exceeds the supply. The overwhelming bulk of discussions around climate change, global climate change, has been on finding ways to increase alpha. That's one of the weaknesses of that literature. As I come in from outside, I've not worked on climate change, but that's one grave error, I think, in my judgment. It's been on alpha, mitigation, find alternative sources of energy. Very reasonable thing to do, but the point is, the idea is that if you increase alpha, then of course you're reducing the left-hand side of the inequality. You're dividing by a larger number. If the denominator rises, then ny upon alpha declines, other things equal. So the way to combat that inequality, to bring it into an inequality, would be to increase alpha. That's the only thing that's been discussed. But of course, it's been a failure. We haven't managed it. Paris is Paris. Maybe it'll change, but it hasn't so far. There are two other factors which are completely neglected because we are shy of discussing them. Capital N and small y. The numerator is aggregate demand, and their population numbers and the quality, the kind of life we want to lead. That's missing from this discussion for reasons I don't need to belabor. You are as familiar with it as any. But I think if we are serious about these matters, nothing should be out of the table. It is, to me, a very sad thing that family planning expenditure as a proportion of international aid is abysmally low. 0.6% of global international aid goes to family planning. And usually the family planning experts sit in the basement of their government offices. They're not the stars. But of course, at the margin, they can be of enormous help. And help because we're looking at not today's N, but tomorrow's capital N. Reproductive successes, as it were, if you like. And it meets the needs of so many unwanted pregnancies that women suffer from. And if you read the literature on this class of issues, it's really shocking because we, on the one hand, talk about gender issues, and we are not allowing a deep expression of the demand for safe pregnancies and so forth on our agenda. So I think there's room there, a huge amount of room. This is not about coercion, it's not about one-child family policy and so forth. We are looking at the fact that if asked, women respond positively to be given information and help over family planning. Over and over again, it's been seen. What about small y? Well, we talk about it, and we change our behavior. Plastics changes very quickly in a matter of months. But we need to talk about that too. But I want to conclude by pointing to some hope. And that hope, for me, lies in an undetected aspect of the human personality. And it makes its mark in both capital N and small y. Small y is consumption, standard of living, which is that all the models that we teach youngsters in economics and the models that drive treasury across the world, treasury models of the macroeconomy, are built on the idea that we are egoists. We care about are, of course, we care about our family, but that's about it. It's a supermarket picture of life. We are encouraged to spend because otherwise employment is in jeopardy. So you feel you're doing a social good by visiting the supermarket more often than less often. But the egoist picture is that it's the story in which what you care about is your income or your wealth, depending on long horizon you look at, and the prices that you face for goods and services. You don't look, in the supermarket story, you don't look to see what others are consuming. And that's this lack of socialness in our personalities, which I think probably is undermining many of our search for ways to reduce the left-hand side, the numerator of the. There is a good deal of evidence now coming from sociology, anthropology in the field of consumption behavior and fertility behavior, which points to the fact that our behavior is influenced by the behavior of our neighbors, peer group. Now, that sounds banal, but it's not banal when you think that the model is rejected in everything that we do in economics, whether it's the treasury model or the models we teach, and what gives us our architecture of our conception of the human economy. Now, I'll concentrate on the conformist side of our preferences, our aspirations, which is we don't want to be too different from others, those we care about. It could be our neighbors. It could be the internet might make us extend our horizon to people we don't even know. And this is not speculation, by the way. There's now a good deal of empirical work on this, very sound ones, natural experiments, which confirm what I'm just now saying. But we need more of this kind of research. But it says that a shared lowering of something is far less costly than unilateral lowering. We hear anecdotes from our grandparents or parents, depending on your age, that during the war there was general deprivation, but it was shared deprivation. They were rationing. And they weren't going to say we were deeply unhappy. They're very worried about the war, but unhappiness is not the first thing they talk about. They talk about the fact that, the country is at risk and so forth, but that's a different kind of anxiety. So there were some anecdotal things, but we have never built on that to try and understand how to test for it from raw data. There are reasons why econometricians do not like to think about this kind of problem, because there are endogeneity issues in writing down these equations. There's a formal reason for it, but technique should not stop us from thinking. A lack of technique shouldn't stop us from thinking. So I would argue that there is hope if we could somehow recognize the deep wedge between the left-hand side and the right-hand side of what I've got in inequality. And to close the gap will require of us to reduce the left-hand side. And one class of ways will be to reduce the numerator of the left-hand side, not simply increase the denominator. Then, if we search hard enough for evidence and ways of thinking about the human condition, I think there is a chance that we will be willing to take cuts because it will be shared, or shared not just amongst ourselves, but perhaps shared with those who are less fortunate. But those are speculations at the moment. I'll conclude there because these problems are difficult, and I've tried to give you in an hour's talk a sense of how difficult it is, how treacherous the terrain is, because science is difficult, the economics is difficult, but on top of that, there is sensitivities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I just want to, we're going to have a couple of questions. First, my name is Adrian Orr, and I'm here representing the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. I'll stop shouting and use the microphone. That would be sensible, wouldn't it? Just before we rush to questions, I just want to acknowledge Victoria University of Wellington, capital Wellington, for working so closely with us, with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. This series of lectures from distinguished professors has been going on for many, many years now. In fact, I could probably say decades safely. And tonight, I would say I've never seen such an engaged and large audience. Sir Partha has stood up and done everything that Wendy promised us, in the sense that he is tackling the largest issues that I believe an economist can tackle. You're doing it with enormous humanity and insight. Many people could understand that, whether you are an economics professional or someone involved in the sciences. So that shows true understanding. You took it from the absolute micro through to macro, through to global in terms of the understanding, unifying the thought on the way through. Not only that, you took it from a single time period, but intergenerational, which is too often missed around the conversations that have gone on. And you are using standard tools. You're standing on the shoulders of giants to bring back things that really matter to us, because what gets measured generally gets managed. And I love the idea that you bring in there that even approximations of important things are better than ignoring those important things altogether when you're managing it, and you're thinking about a portfolio, long-term sustainable activity. So it's a wonderful thing. I'm also very impressed that the UK, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is thinking beyond just Brexit and supporting important research and being able to use wonderful people like yourself to do the important work that you are doing. So I am absolutely humbled to be here and part of it. Now we have, can you just say, we're 5 minutes for questions? That clock, by the way, you spoke so well, time went backwards. So we've got 10 minutes, we've got roving microphones, and please keep your questions as questions and short and concise. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the good talk, and I have many questions, but I'll ask the simplest one. Just the number you mentioned, international dollars from 1950s 3,000 to the current 15,000. Does that the international dollar GDP from 1950s 3,000 to nowadays 15,000? Does that actually factor in the inflation and the purchasing power? So equivalent to, okay, thank you.
And, over here, yep, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Now, in spite of that we live in a connected world and we consume things made elsewhere, have you looked at different countries, how much they have kept or squandered their natural capital? And you could give us a few examples of good countries which have kept most of their natural capital compared to the 1950 situation?
I think you're asking whether we've measured nations' destruction of wealth. Is that correct? Natural capital.
Thank you very much.
Picking up a Norwegian accent, is it?
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you asked the question, because it's something I've worked on myself and I've encouraged others to do. So the question is, we started by thinking in terms of wealth as being, let's say, these three categories of capital assets, and how do they pan out if you look at some time series in different countries. The most recent work that's been done has been done by the United Nations Environment Programme, called the Inclusive Wealth of Nations, Report 2018, came out in 2018. And it has about 120 countries. I mean, look, if you can't be sensitive when you read this kind of stuff. It's really vulgar. But that's the best thing that's going. And I also like to say to myself that the World Bank publications are equally vulgar. It's just that we don't say it because they're powerful and they've been doing it for a long time, so we're used to it. So what do they find? They find that for most countries in the third world and the poor countries in Africa, there are only 45 countries from the developing side. There was accumulation of human capital per capita and produced capital per capita, but declining natural capital. Now that decline is in some sense an upper bound, because many forms of natural capital are missing for data reasons. You have forests are valued for timber, subsoil resources, you can guess, agriculture and so forth, but the ecosystem services that we were talking about here are missing for obvious reasons. So there are biased answers, but you do get a picture that the trade-off has been consistent with what the macro story I've been telling you here, which is that we've gone for accumulation of produced and human capital, decumulation of natural capital. And the rates of return, that exercise I did, explained to you that it's just the wrong thing to have done. Or we've done it to the extent that it's now terribly wrong. We ought to now reverse the accumulation process.
Sorry? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask for your interpretation of the Schumacher, the small is beautiful model, and particularly around the intermediate technology he speaks about. Do you have a view on his writing, his philosophy? It seems very similar to yours in some ways.
Well, yes. I mean, the trouble is when Kant wish technologies in, and one of the things I was trying to point to, albeit far too briefly in my lecture, was that in some sense the incentives need to be there for developing intermediate technology or the small-scale technology. I mean, you didn't need Schumacher. Mahatma Gandhi was very much, he spent his life promoting small-scale industry, the handloom and so forth. These ideas have been around for a long while, and there's much truth in it. We need to explore all of this. I mean, I'm not card-carrying one thing or the other. It's sort of, in my last life, I must have done something wrong. I'm sort of been embedded in trying to dissect problems as opposed to coming up with solutions. That's the nature of the work I do.
Thank you.
Yeah, kia ora. Your story's clearly very accurate for the developing world. I just wondered if you had any comment on the technology optimist story for the developed world that we're starting to hear is that growth has actually decoupled from resource use. I just wondered if you had any comment on those sorts of claims.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question too, like the previous ones. Again, it's a matter of the metaphor. One reason I highlighted the pollution side, the fact that you have to throw back, material must balance. What you take out in one form or the other, degraded form or not, has to be put back in there, tells me something. I spent a bit of time discussing the equivalence between pollution and conservation with a different sign, of course. There was a purpose behind it. It says that the idea that in some sense you can produce independent of the biosphere by substituting away indefinitely is really a problematic position to take. Take this inequality that's already ahead in front of you on the left-hand side, the alpha. A hard-boiled technology is going to say, oh, don't worry about it, because for any increase of the numerator ny, imagine that technology can come to the rescue by raising alpha correspondingly. Then, of course, the ratio won't really increase. And if alpha can go to infinity faster than ny can, then what's the problem? The ratio goes to zero. So you're very, very much in a sustainable world. That's always the question is whether there are biogeochemical reasons why alpha can't increase indefinitely. Some people raise the second law of thermodynamics to that effect. Georgescu-Rosen did. I won't go that far at all because I don't know the time scale involved. I'd go far more to broad biogeochemical reasons for skepticism that alpha can be raised indefinitely. If you ask yourself how many trophic levels there are in an ecosystem, you will find at best 5, I think 6 may be the maximum that's been observed. By trophic levels, I mean little, tiny, microbes, and then one lives on the neck, the next one lives on the top of that, and so forth. I think 5, at best 6. Why? Why can't there be hundreds? And the reason is there is energy loss at every move from the bottom to the next one, about 10%. That causes the problem. That is the kind of argument I would use to say there are limits to the extent to which alpha, in principle, can be increased. Now, if alpha is bounded above, no matter what, no matter how ingenious you are, because you have to dump the stuff there, and nature will react to that, then you have an upper bound on ny if you wish to close the gap between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. I'm deeply skeptical of the technological argument because it sort of reminds me, I don't mean you, I mean, because I hear it all the time. My mother was a fabulous lady, and she and I were great friends, but whenever I asked her to explain to me what's a problematic situation, how it will pan out, she would always say, God willing. And I feel the technology story is that technology will come to our rescue, is like my mother telling me, God willing.
I think we've got one more question here, is that right? And 2 questions, and then we're done. There are 2 great questions, so nice and short.
Yes, yeah, thanks very much for the talk. I enjoyed it a lot, so thanks really. So I have actually a very fundamental question for you. You were introduced as a visionary, right? You were introduced as a visionary in your field, right? So when we talk about a global biosphere, I have a very simple question. Can this problem be solved by individual governments alone? Because to me, it's logically
Thank you. Question
not possible.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But just as in the climate change debates, it's not a national problem alone. We are looking at international ones. Goes without saying. I elided over these issues here in this lecture as to where the source of decision is going to be. As I said, I was pointing to the global problem. But you're quite right. It has to be done at the international level. And again, having said that, I correct myself a little bit, because it's really not going to be just the international. This is one area where you see, if you like, gradation of institutions, starting from the village up through the. So we need to think. I mean, in fact, I'm going to write I'm having a chapter written in the review on that. Polycentric institutions, which is you have nodes which cover a group. Just at a village, you may have households, clusters of villages in a watershed. Would have to amalgamate, have to have some coordination to manage the watershed. Then you lift yourself up, as you can see now, to higher aggregation level. And you need coordination across other groups, higher level groups, until you come to the international one. I think there's a deep story to be told in political science of the design of institutions. By design, you don't create them, but you encourage their formation. And so the village voice is extremely important here, totally important, because it's the local biodiversity which is at risk. So this is one area where the command story of the center or the global economy, global decision-making influencing this problem is deeply problematic. It really has to come right from the ground up and then back again. So that's a polycentric story of human institutions.
Yes. And lucky last.
Thank you very much for your very challenging talk. Do you think that the language of economics around assets and capitals and productivity and services perpetuates the whole anthropocentric view of the world, that this is not a natural world-centric? And also with your equation, the increasing N is because of increasing life expectancy rather than increasing birth rates, which are going down. So are you wanting to see drops in life expectancy? The increasing Y is the improvement in poverty, getting people out of poverty. We wouldn't want to see that decrease as well. So increasing NY brings with it a lot of challenges.
Can you just remind me of the first point you made?
It was around the nomenclature that's used within economics.
Absolutely. I did take an anthropocentric position here because I talked in terms of prices, capital gains. But nothing I said is actually anthropocentric in bearing. So suppose you had a viewpoint where you're an animist and you value nature because there's an intrinsic value to nature over and above what it does for us. That's for sure. You can do that. And then you still have an asset management problem because you have to live. You can be an animist, but still you're having to pluck fruit, plant trees, look after your cattle or goats or whatever it is, till the soil. So you are managing your assets, no matter what. But the value you impute to the assets, of course, is now colored by your animism. Okay? So everything I do here in terms of asset management goes through, has to go through, because the logic of it is independent of the value system. He'll be asking himself, he will have a right to ask himself, he should be intelligent enough to ask himself, suppose I don't cut the tree down now, which I do need for firewood, what would be the increase in biomass of that tree next year? He doesn't use biomass, but he says, will there be new branches? And if you read some of the anthropological literature on local ecosystems, management of local ecosystems in Africa, they are fascinating. There are rules and regulations regarding when you can take fruit from a tree, when you can take twigs out of the tree for fuel purposes, which part of the year it's okay. You have enormously rich data that anthropologists have found in coastal regions, coastal fisheries, to the extent where they say on Wednesdays, that's arbitrary, certain days of the week, you don't fish in this part of the coastline, concentrate on that part of the coastline, and also depending on the season. So they have some notion of the migratory pattern of the fish, which is, of course, an asset. And the production function is implicit in their thinking. Now, I don't know if they think fish have souls and so forth. That's not the point. But the point is that I know of no study in which people didn't care about the asset base on which they live. Because if they didn't, they would be dead. The mere survival says that they've been very smart, tried their best. And of course, the external environment can collapse to the point where they can't, even their best is not good enough. And that would happen if, for example, the whole island goes underwater. And then. So I don't think the anthropocentricity has much of an impact here. I've, of course, concentrated on prices and incomes and GDP and so forth. But that's a way of handling our impact. What are we doing our activities are affecting the biosphere. How do I measure that activity? Well, I took GDP n times Y. You're quite right, of course. A great deal of the increase in N is due to life expectancy going up. There's mortality rates going down. But let me show you here the UN forecast projection of global population. And there, we are now, you can't see the details that I can tell you probably know. It's from 1950 to 2100. Currently 7.7 billion, but the mean estimate is 10.2 billion in 2100. And in Africa, it will expand from currently just over 1 billion to 4 billion, or 3.8 billion. Now, never mind whether it's life expectancy increasing or not, the fact is there's an overwhelming problem that continent faces. It's very poor. And you have a total fertility rate which is about 4.8 now, even now. And of course, they're correcting for changes in total fertility rate. So when I talked about gender issues, that really does lie at the heart of many of these issues. And the more we recognize that, the more hope there is that we'll be able to do something to help. Because we care about gender issues, and we should care about gender issues, and yet we ignore something very fundamentally important for women. I've been influenced in this, by the way, in a huge way by my daughter, youngest daughter. So she's my co-author on this kind of stuff, so she tells me how to think on these matters.
Thank you very much. Can I just note that his mother and his daughter are the two guiding lights in everything you understand by the sounds of things. So, but that is wonderful. I do get a sense that the challenge will be, just because it doesn't work in practice doesn't mean it won't work in theory. And it is that practice. I'm very, very encouraged that conservation is the inverse of pollution, and it sounds much more fun to focus on conservation than to clean up pollution. So I want to, one last round of applause, please, and thank you again.